Hi, my name is Romy, and the skill that I had chosen to learn for this assessment was sewing. Now, I have absolutely no background in sewing. I have never learnt how to sew before, so this is a brand new skill to me. And in order to design this program, under the constraints-led approach, I use Newell's model of motor learning and the three phases, as well as the concept of the perceptual motor landscape. Now, my aim really here was to develop functional movement solutions and to overcome the multiple degrees of freedom, given that this was a new skill. And in order to assess how I went over the training program, I actually decided to sew a tote bag at the end of my program. So as I just said, I used the Newell's model of training to organize my program over 3 phases, which you will see in the coming slides. In order to learn the skill of sewing, I understood that I needed to transition through different learning phases by creating temporary states of coordination. So going off that perceptual motor landscape. However, in order to even create a phase of coordination, I knew that there are a lot of degrees of freedom that I needed to solve and wrap my head around. So the number one being the machine setup, threading the needle, and also stitching in a straight line, as well as creating an overlocker at the end for my bag. So before constructing my program, I needed to manipulate different fabrics. So this was the number one thing that I worked on before even designing a program and just sort of getting my head around doing anything to do with sewing. I decided to use a stretch fabric and a normal cotton fabric. So those 2 videos show me working with 2 different sort of fabrics. As this was a new skill, there are a repertoire of new constraints. So there are a number of different things that I use from the constraints-led approach in order to learn this. So there were a number of constraints that I was dealing with this skill. First off being the physical constraints. Functional was the perception of the needs on the fabric and whether or not it needed a straight line stitch, a zigzag stitch. This was very much dependent on the actual fabric. Structural constraint was the grip strength of my fingers on the fabric and the fine motor control of threading the actual thread into the needle hole. Informational was the feeling of different fabrics and the ability to thread them through the machine. There was a major difference between stretch fabric and cotton fabric, which I found quite early on within my training program. Self-organization was that ability to achieve those stable states of coordination when sewing a straight line and how easy it was to control the fabric and push it through the machine. So this was varied very much between the fabrics that I was using with the cotton, stretch fabric, and so on. Constraints and movement coordination. So organismic and individual constraints came down to having strong hand-eye coordination, the environment that I was working within, so the room and the surface, it was always a controlled environment. So I had the air conditioning on and the surface I was consistently using a dining room table, and my task was the type of stitch that was actually needed for that fabric. So once I had established the constraints and what I was actually going to use from the constraints-led approach in order to construct my training program, I went straight ahead and constructed a 4-week training program based off Newell's 3-stage model. So the first week was to assemble that coordination pattern. As you can see in this table, I used a lot of observational learning. So Scully and Newell's concept, I used this from doing YouTube and also my boyfriend's mum, who is a great sewer. So I broke up my sessions into a lot of 1 to 2 hour blocks each week, as I found that at the beginning I was quite frustrated easily with the skill, and also I didn't really want to get sick of it. So I chose to do it mostly on a Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday for the 4-week period. So instantly I knew that I needed to solve quite a few degrees of freedom. So basically what I wanted to do at the very beginning in order to learn how to do a straight line stitch, I included a lot of sewing pins along the stitch line to make a straight line. So that instantly solved one of the degrees of freedom, which I struggled with quite instantly, and I used that as a guide. This also helped to create that stable pattern. However, once I felt comfortable with it, that's when I removed the pins in order to not get too comfortable in that attractor state. I also transitioned this skill onto a number of different fabrics, as I was discussing before, so stretch fabric and also a cotton, just to ensure that I wasn't just getting too comfortable with learning on one piece of fabric, as I know that I needed to do something with my bag at the end of the 4-week period. So it wasn't actually until week 2 that I started to really jump into using different stitches. So I used the straight line stitch and the zigzag stitch, and I alternated between the two to get familiar with both of them, as they both have quite a lot of different requirements. I continued to start at the very beginning of threading the machine every time I sat down to use the sewing machine. So that really helped me get an understanding of what sort of thread that I was using. So moving into week 3, it wasn't until here that I actually started to sew on the same fabric for my tote bag. So I had adapted well to using the stretch and the cotton fabric, and now I was introducing a brand new type of fabric. So I began to still do what I was doing in week 1 and week 2, but the aim here was really to have that skilled optimization of control. So I began to sew different shapes on the tote bag, different squares, love hearts, boxes, just to get familiar with moving around and actually having that tactile feeling in my hands of the fabric. I also started to then practice this very similar shapes of the tote bag. So I practiced creating the bag handles. Once I had completed those 3 phases from Newell's constraints, I then decided week 4 was just about creating that final product. So creating the tote bag. This is when I started to use actual measuring products. So I used the fabric scissors, I used a ruler and things like that to make sure that I had that quality that I wanted for that final bag. So the performance outcome and measures. As this was an individual task, I needed to ensure that I was staying on the right track and I wasn't really sticking to those attractor states for too long. So I decided to create a qualitative checklist for weeks 1, 3, and 4 that I got my boyfriend's mum to fill out for me, as she was the one that was majority of the time looking over me while I was sewing. Within this checklist, it measured my efficiency rating, my transfer tests, and also how I was actually breaking down the skill. So I asked her to rate me out of 5 on the work that I was doing, and she assessed this on all the different fabrics that I did. So the cotton fabric, the stretch fabric, and the same fabric that I used for my tote bag. And as well as this, I did the regular transfers test, which consisted of me setting up the machine from the beginning and choosing random bits of fabric and selecting the right stitch to sew together. So as you can see on the qualitative checklist here, I got a rating out of 5 for 4 different things. There was the efficiency of movement, the accuracy of sewing a straight stitch, the ability to sew the machine accurately, and also how I transferred the skills onto other different bits of fabric. So I got her to fill this out 3 times, and from there, that is really at the end how I assessed my results. So I used that qualitative checklist to create this table and a graph so I could get a better understanding of how I progressed. As you can see in weeks 3 and 4, that's where my biggest improvement was. What I wanted to touch on the most was that ability to transfer skills onto different fabrics and stitches. So that was something that I did quite well even from the get-go, and I really think that came down to using a different bunch of fabrics so I could have that transfer ability onto different types of fabric, as well as my accuracy of sewing a straight stitch. At the beginning this was very poor, but by introducing those pins and creating that attractor state, that was something that also had a huge improvement in weeks 3 and 4, as well as my efficiency of movement and the ability to set up a sewing machine, which I did from the very beginning. Here is the final video of me actually putting together my tote bag. One of the questions that I asked myself at the end of the 4-week program was, did my results reflect my program? And I believe that it did. So just going through my strengths of the program and as well as the limitations, I believe that my biggest strengths were my hand-eye coordination, the consistency of my weekly practice. So breaking down that skill into 4 days a week, I think was one of the best parts of my program, as the information was fresh in my mind and I was able to jump straight back into those phases of coordination quite easily. I believe that those transfer tests that I did in weeks 1, 3, and 4 were also a huge help, because I was comfortable with using a whole bunch of different fabrics, from the stretch to the cotton to the fabric that I use at the very end, as well as watching multiple YouTube videos. I think this really helped me understand the stitches, so the straight line stitch and the zigzag stitch, because at the beginning I used the straight line stitch, and then for my bag I knew that that was the appropriate stitch to use. On top of that, actually having that final product was a huge motivation for me as well throughout the whole program, because I knew that I needed to learn these skills correctly in order to produce something that was good quality. And also I was able to get that clear result and understanding of how I did over the 4 weeks. In terms of my limitations, my retention and my transfer was probably one of the biggest limitations in saying that, because although I did use multiple different fabrics, when it did come to, as you could see in the results page previously, weeks 3 and 4, I think that I should have used a fabric that was a little bit more similar to what I used for my bag, as I did struggle to sew straight stitches due to the fact it was so thick. Observational learning was something that I used throughout the entire program, so from YouTube and watching Sam. However, I do believe that I should have implemented a more hands-off approach, as there were some stages where I did heavily rely on her to help me or assist me or tell me what I needed to do in terms of the stitch and how to sew that up. So that really comes down to the retention of the skill. If I were to remove her from the situation, would I still be able to do this skill as efficiently? That's something that I probably should have done in my last week. As well as that verbal feedback, she was consistently there and sort of coaching me and guiding me through it. So retention and transfer could have been something that I could have tested without her completely at the very end. As well as that adaptability, I think, comes down into that. So to conclude my assessment, I just wanted to discuss really the importance of that perceptual motor landscape in order to create that training program, especially with what I did with my assessment. So really learning new tasks, it completely involves changing the entire perceptual motor landscape. So basically what we did learn in class as well was through the novice jugglers and how they can catch and throw, but they can't combine them into coordinated behaviors unless the perceptual motor landscape is altered to accommodate this. So this was something that I really stuck by me throughout the training program, as I may have been able to sew a straight line stitch and do a whole bunch of things, but actually putting it into play and creating a tote bag allowed me to change that perceptual motor landscape in order to achieve that. So on top of that, it is also comes down to the intrinsic dynamics of the learner and whether or not they match the task dynamics. So I believe that my intrinsic matched my task dynamics. So I found that my learning was accelerated as I was involved in creating the tote bag. However, if they do not match the task dynamics, then the learning would have been a whole lot more difficult and there would have been a larger individual. So something that I did discuss just before was the transfer and adaptability and getting that learner out of the ruck, which was something that I did understand at the very beginning, which is why I did the transfer test. However, gradually weakening the stability of the existing attractor states was something that I probably could have done a little bit better. For example, practicing the same technique but changing the context and the task variation. So I could have changed the speed that I was sewing at, especially with the foot pedal, you're allowed to do that, as well as perturb the system from an existing attractor state, which is something that I didn't really do, and it was more of a radical approach. And maybe if I did implement this in my training program, my transfer to that final product would have been a little bit more seamless. In order to discuss this in more of a practical sense, I decided to use a novice athlete in the gym and how that they would use the constraints-led approach to allow for a seamless skill acquisition. So if someone has just come into the gym and they're learning to, say, do a barbell back squat, you would change the environment and you would also change the equipment that they use. So if you would first start off with an air squat, you would then go into a box squat with a dumbbell, and then you could go into using a barbell back squat, as well as making sure they're in a very safe, similar environment, which are two things that I did from the very beginning. Especially with my environment, I made sure that I was in the dining room table, it was a cool environment and I was comfortable, and then using the different equipment, for example, starting off on an easier cotton, then transferring all the way to that final piece of cotton that I used. Thanks very much for listening to my presentation. I had an absolute ball learning how to sew. This was something that I really, really enjoyed, and I'm actually really looking forward to continuing to learn this skill